Welcome to the Praxologie podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. We hope our recent Q&A was just delightful for your ears, or maybe even your eyes if you watched on YouTube. And we equally hope it was exhilarating to your mind to help you think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. On today's episode, we take a turn in our series, Serving Missionally, your Knowledge Toolkit for Success, toward mental health, a big topic. In this episode, we limit to Generation Z or Generation Z, depending on how you prefer to say it, and also Generation Alpha, a new generation that's just been named and is still growing. And we talk about the growing issue of anxiety. I'm Sean Smith, your host, with Tyler Patty.
Hello.
I would say as always, but
not as always anymore.
Recently, it hasn't been the case.
Where have you been, Sean?
I have been on my couch, not leaving my house for, I don't even know how long, 6 weeks?
No, I think it was 3 weeks.
It felt like forever.
Yeah.
Anyway, had the flu and then 2 rounds of pneumonia. Quite awful. Anyway.
Maybe it was longer than 3 weeks, if you go back all the way to the beginning.
I think it was.
Yeah.
I had something and then the flu and then I've just been sick for a long time. And I've been looking forward to being back. Many thanks to Landon for filling in my spot for the Q&A. Hopefully you enjoyed that. And I'm sure Landon had some wonderful things to say.
Oh, he did.
I haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, but I'm going to. But let's go into now the idea of generations and anxiety and kind of ask, how do we lead anxious generations? So we'll start with defining and characterizing the 2 generations that I named, and then we'll turn toward anxiety, which sounds like a horror movie or something. But we'll turn
toward anxiety.
Talking about...
Should we be moving away from anxiety?
Well, it's as if the 2 generations and talking about them causes us anxiety.
Uh-huh.
That's not the case. We like these generations.
We do.
They're great. And they're in our ministries now. They're worth thinking about. And it's worth us reflecting on anxiety and the issue of anxiousness. As well, we'll see that it's very common in the younger generations at the moment. So let's jump into our first, Generation Z.
Great. So Generation Z, the good Brits that we are, say Generation Z. We've talked about Generation Z before, so we'll just summarize here. So Gen Z typically falls between the years 97 to about 2012. When that ends is always a little bit debatable, but we have some students that fall directly into this slot.
We do.
So we know what these guys are like. They're great. So Tim Elmore, who's an expert or is somebody who talks a lot about generations.
He's researched a lot. Does a lot of ethnographic studies of generations to get a feel for who are these people.
Yep.
And how can we assist them in our ministries and businesses.
Yep.
So he's kind of an expert on Generation Z and at this point one of the only ones talking about Generation Alpha.
Yep. Yeah. So Tim Elmore has a lecture on YouTube you could look up called Gen Z Unfiltered, where he compares millennials to Gen Z. So millennials, that's us.
Mm-hmm.
That's us. So what's the difference? So he goes through, so I'll list them as well for you all. So number 1, moving from confidence to caution. Number 2, spending to saving. Number 3, attacking education to hacking one, kind of piecing their own education together.
From online.
From online, exactly. 4, from idealism to pragmatism. Number 5, consuming media to creating it.
Gen Z, they're crazy with that.
They're crazy good at creating stuff. Number 6, viral to vanishing posts. You can see that in the rise of TikTok. Not TikTok, what is it? Yeah, is it TikTok? No. Now I don't know. I'm second guessing myself.
The ones that disappear after like 10 seconds.
Instagram stories. I know that and even anyway, stuff that disappears. Number 7, feeling special to feeling savvy. Ooh. We like to feel special, don't we, Sean?
Millennials tend to gravitate towards that.
We want everybody to know how unique we are.
Maybe we should define savvy as well.
Savvy is like clever.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Number 8, text message to iconic message. So that would be like emojis, yeah? Or even more than that.
What do you call them? Like influencers and that kind of stuff. I think probably fits an iconic message as well.
And number 9, anticipation to anxiety. We grew up, we talked about this in the podcast before, millennials, we've grown up being told, hey, the world is your oyster. A very American expression. You have limitless possibilities. You can change the world. And so we're living in anticipation of that. When are things going to change? And Gen Z is aware of how bad things are, and they feel anxious about that. So anxiety is obviously plays a really important role in this list, and it's a shift. Not that Gen Zs don't experience anxiety, but it's a lot more baseline for Gen Z. It's like part of the package for them. And what makes Gen Z challenging is that they have a high desire to empower themselves with an equally high desire to be mentored. You've talked about that before as well. They want to be savvy, clever, accomplished. They also do want input, although they don't want people telling them exactly, be like me.
Exactly. Yeah. It's, that lived paradox is really on the leaders of people, like youth leaders who have Gen Z in their ministry or something, to figure out how to empower and encourage at the same time, but also give the authority, I suppose, to the student.
Yes, it is difficult. Yeah. And Elmore says that the key is to instill confidence in them while also being encouraging. So, for example, he would kind of push a Gen Z student to say, I'm giving you some hard feedback because I have high expectations and I know that you can reach them. You can do this. So we got to remember, working with Gen Z students and leaders, to be encouraging and challenging. They need that challenge.
And also that encouragement. When you say something like what Elmore says, and I've tested it with students and it works, like they rise to the occasion, because you communicate, you have ability. I know you can do it, and that actually empowers them, but you also encourage, which gives them motivation to the empowerment for them to actually accomplish, which is pretty cool. On remembering, it's something that God tells the people of God to do, like over and over in the Old Testament.
Remember.
In the New, it's more prevalent in the Old Testament. Elmore, again, he says, the secret is enabling them, Gen Z, to retain an accurate memory, yet positive narrative. So I think this is good European realism with a flavor of American optimism in the best sense of optimism there. It's not pushing bad things or issues away. Instead, it deals with them by remembering the whole story, which always includes the positive and the negative. And the result is really about, I think, perception of events that happen in selecting not what, but how we will remember. And so Elmore says, not prove my point, but to back it up anyway, the secret is choosing the narrative we will carry with us. And that might sound like we're all driving our own little narrative moving forward, and sometimes we bump into others. It's not exactly as individualistic as it seems. And I think if we think theologically about this for just a minute, Tom McCall in Analytic Christology, I probably have mentioned this before on the podcast, I just don't remember. He borrows from this psychological, or you probably could say sociological theory of narrative identity. And he uses that in theology to say that we're all living out a master narrative. something that we think is true in what society and others are telling us of certain things. And then a counter story is something that runs counter to the master narrative. And so he's using this in reference to Galatians 2:20, where Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ in me. Well, he's trying to unpack and go into what that means. I'll leave some of that aside for now. Maybe we'll come back to it at some point later. But he's saying that Paul's new life in Christ is the counter story. So the counter story is the gospel, which means that applied to Paul, who says, we went from the master narrative of haughty oppressor, McCall's words, one who's ruining the church. That was his master narrative, to the counter story of the gospel and proclaiming the goodness of God and building up the church. And eventually the counter story becomes the master narrative. But that is an interesting thought if we think, what's the master narrative I'm living out? And how does the gospel run counter to that? And which one am I truly living by? And if we apply that as we are going through and experiencing different events, that can help us to select how we remember and inviting that counter story of the gospel in to the whole scenario to bring in some positives to balance out the realistic negatives.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
But starting with the realism is something that very much fits with how Gen Zs are wired. So if for example, if Paul was a member of Generation Z, which is interesting to think about, he would need to, if a leader was trying to work with him, that leader would need to remind him of his past and not just ignore it or act like, oh, it's not in play anymore. That those things happen. The thing, and for Gen Zs today, they're very aware of ways that they have failed, of the ways that society has failed, the things that are hard, difficult, wrong, but also want to be guided, want to be spurred on towards the silver lining, towards the positive. So Paul's a great example on this. Like you said, like the old story or the original story, and then yes, that happened, that was real, but there is a new story that you can live out of. That is good news for somebody who's in a member of Generation Z, and especially one who's experiencing kind of this ever-present anxiety.
Yeah, and if we then move into the next generation, Generation Alpha, this was a universally agreed upon term from he's literally one of the only other guys studying Gen Alpha right now, apart from Tim Elmore that I'm aware of. And I can't think of his name, but he basically went around the world and talked to a bunch of sociologists and researchers and said, what do we call this younger generation? Because they're no longer Z.
What's after Z?
We don't know. We don't feel like being creative. How about just starting over?
Just hop over to a different alphabet.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of strange. Most generations like Gen X. Like, are there previous generations that were discussed? I mean, not really. So we're kind of just going X, Y, Z, A. just start over.
Start over.
And we see that with early studies from Gen A that level of anxiety increases. Maybe it's not coming and going. It's not perceived. It's more felt, like all the time. It's just naturally part of who this generation is. And by the way,
and can you give parameters for Generation Alpha? Who are we talking about here?
I disagree with Elmore. Elmore is very American, if I may say, and I think that skews his data. So he thinks that Gen Alpha begins like 2015 or 2016 because of the huge election. That was very divisive. Republican, very forward speaking, and equally on the opposite side. And because of a lot of those kinds of social factors, he thinks that that's where the generation began. And the theory behind that, which is typically true from sociology, is that when a new generation begins, it's usually thrust forward by a big event. So he puts, Elmore's putting forward that this, the election and the things swirling around it with social justice issues and some other things, again, based in the U.S., 2015 or 2016. I think that it's probably actually starting sooner than that. Is it 2012? Probably not. 2013, 14? There's no universal agreement. I just think it's a little bit earlier probably than Elmore says.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about people who are now 13, 14 at the oldest.
At the oldest. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whereas for Elmore, they'd be like 8, 9.
Yes. Yeah. I have an 8-year-old son, so he's in that category no matter what.
It's true. Yeah. By the way, I've mentioned 2 people that are pseudo experts or sort of experts on Generation Alpha, and our team at the Josiah Venture Research Institute is partnering with some key people in the international team of Josiah Venture to launch a 2-year study to characterize Generation Alpha in Central and Eastern Europe. So stay tuned for more on that in the coming couple of years. We'll have some things coming out that are adding to the body of literature on understanding Generation Alpha and working with them well in ministry. But back to Elmore's preliminary research on Alpha, he says we see 7 things. And you can hear him talk about these things. Maybe they're on YouTube now, I'm not sure, but also on growingleaders.com. If you go there, he's very connected. I'm not sure if he founded it or not, but very connected. And you can see the lecture there. And you can even, I think, if you watch it, you may be able to sign up for the free ebook, I think. But he says 7 things. Generation Alpha is the most currently and going to be the most educated generation ever. Number 2, the most technologically immersed generation ever. Number 3, the most materially endowed generation ever.
So the most stuff available to them.
Resources just everywhere. Is this true in all portions of Europe? It's true in America. There's some weighing there. I think that his cultural lens is factoring into some of these things, perhaps, which is why we're launching a study for Central and Eastern Europe in part. Number 4, the most impatient generation ever. Give it to me now, because you don't have to watch commercials on TV anymore. Although, unless you have subscriptions now, you have to watch commercials on YouTube and all your streaming services.
But you can skip them after 5 seconds.
And my kids get crazy. Like, you're interrupting my show. And they're impatient. And they're not even part of this generation. Actually,
they will be.
They are a part of this generation. I just can't do math. Number 5, the most self-directed generation ever. Seeing things done from a young age. Even my daughter, who is like not quite 3 months old, she's seeing things that my other 2 children do and mimicking them. And then my daughter walking around with a pretend cell phone, and recently has been like laying back, like adults do, and tapping on her pretend phone. Like she's going through her apps and stuff.
No, going through her
it's
apps.
a very, very self-directed generation. We learn by YouTube these kinds of things. The most virtual relationships over human ever. And Elmore conjectures that it may be equal. That we might have
value?
No, that we might have equal 50-50 relationships online versus actual in-human contact, face-to-face.
Yeah.
Versus digital face-to-face. He says it could be 50-50. I think that's overspeak, but anyway.
We will find out.
We'll find out. The 7th, the most likely to spend childhood without both biological parents. That's been an increasing trend of the erosion of family values. I think that's like Christianese.
It is.
But a lot of trends and things that have been happening that are causing people to be divorced much sooner than before, more than ever, and so on. And so this is causing probably number 7 here, the most likely to spend childhood without both biological parents for the duration of their childhood. Now, again, some of these are very focused and face hard boundaries of the U.S. We'll test some of those things and we'll see if it's actually true or not. But a lot of what Elmore says is it's still worth listening to. He's very shrewd. He has wisdom. Some of these don't appear to be felt, again, the same way in Europe. I'll read them once more, and maybe we'll stop and talk about a few of them. Number 1, the most educated generation ever.
Yeah. How? YouTube. I mean, they and Wikipedia. I mean, those are things that we also have had, but one of the interesting trends that has been happening in higher education over the last decade or so has been the move kind of towards unbundling, and which basically offers individual courses that participants choose based on their own interests. So they basically piece together an education based on what they are interested in, what they want to grow in. It's no longer, I go to this university. Well, it is sometimes, but it's moving away from this. I go to this university and this is the program. I have to take these 20 classes, even if I don't like them. Younger generation, they're not as bound by those restrictions. They can piece together their education in whatever way they want.
Yeah, I even got an email yesterday about open access. About putting some of my research to this person so that it could become part of the basically an open access journal that everybody can access, which I think that actually is a good thing. But that's just another resource. That would be for people who are doing that. It's good scholarship getting into the right hands. There are other ways of piecemealing things together. I happen to know a former professor in the U.S. who has seen this trend, I think, I'm just realizing. And he's been watching Wikipedia like in the earlier days when it wasn't as monitored. And he monitored the chemistry pages and made sure that certain things were actually true because he knew that people were going to use this as sources of information for real. Yeah. And so he kind of monitors those things as a way of like making sure people have the right knowledge. But the most educated, fantastic. But just because people who learned the biblical languages 100 years ago versus who learned them now, learned them way better than we do now because technology, and you rely on your cheat sheets and other things way too easily, and you didn't learn it the hard way. And so there are pros and cons, I think, to the educated, and we should probably just ask how. How are they being educated? And are those sources that they're getting them from the best ones?
Yes.
Do they have...
misinformation is just as widespread as more good information.
Yeah, exactly. We should pause on that one. The most tech-immersed generation ever, that's just a given.
That is.
The most material endowed or the most resources ever. Again, whether that's true as much...
I mean, you do think about... in terms of opportunities, like when we were we took our formation students to Chemnitz, we visited the prison, the museum in the prison for political prisoners, and I remember hearing a story of a young student in Germany under communism who wanted to go on vacation. Well, he was reading some things that he wasn't supposed to, and he wanted to go on vacation from Germany to Hungary, and on the way to Hungary, he was imprisoned. And for radicalization, basically. And you just contrast that sort of a reality of a young person, hey, if I read something that I'm not supposed to and I try and go travel and have an experience, it might cost me my freedom. I think of where young people are right now, they can do what they want, essentially. They can have what they want. They can buy stuff on Amazon or Alza here in Czech. And
it's amazing.
It is amazing. So their resources are much more easily accessible, and opportunities and experiences. It's probably not just material.
Yeah, that's accurate, I think, which feeds into number 4, the most impatient. Technology, the resources, the idea of more feeding into some impatience, which gives into small forms of anxiety, which kind of has a cumulative effect that grows and grows. What are we, number 6?
Number 5, most self-directed.
Number 5, the most self-directed, which is interesting from the Gen Z wanting to have like a mentor, but to do it themselves. It seems like maybe Gen A is kind of embodying that in a similar way, but maybe not even seeing the need as much for a mentor. That's pure conjecture.
It'll be really hard. We'll have to see on that one because, again, we're talking maximum, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. But it would make sense to be moving in a direction of greater agency and greater independence, perhaps.
And Elmore also calls Generation Alpha at this point mini millennials. And so if we look at the idea of self-directed from millennials to Gen Z to Gen A, it's kind of interesting. Gen Z, millennials, we're like, we want somebody to speak into our lives, but like there's not, it wasn't happening. And so we kind of, in a sense, grew up in that environment where we just didn't have it. And so that's passed on in a sense to Gen Z. Like, yeah, we want that, but I'm just going to do it myself. And millennials maybe is like, idealism.
Right.
Gen Z is like, no, realism. I'll just, if I'm not going to have one, I'll do it myself.
Yeah.
And so Elmore is saying Gen A might be more like millennials and going back and saying it's still not around. And so we're just going to maybe be idealistic, or maybe it's Gen Z. I would conjecture maybe it's leading more Gen Z, and it's many millennials is a wrong term. But again, we'll see this over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
But either way, what does that say for discipleship and theology in general? That leaders are not pouring into... disciples are not creating disciples who make other disciples. Like that focus is still needed across all three of these generations. I think that just rises to the surface for me at this point.
Yeah. And I like the phrase or the idiom, we're not islands. So even if we can do something, it doesn't mean that we should do something just on our own by ourselves. We grow the most, when we're in proximity to others and we're sharpening each other. So
right.
Can't lose that. Can't lose that vision for discipleship, even if there is a greater agency and sense of I can do it myself kind of attitude.
Yeah, let's go there. The other two again though were virtual relationships over human and childhood without both biological parents. But Elmore does emphasize the idea of Generation Alpha feeling an increased sense of personal agency. You've referenced that a couple of times. So what do you think of this, Tyler? The idea of an increased sense of personal agency, even though there's kind of an anxiousness through that.
I think that there's a great opportunity here for leaders to empower these preteens to be able to face some of the demons that we've become more aware of as Gen Alpha,
figurative or
Gen
literal.
X and Gen Z. I'm speaking in biblical terms in a sense of the demons of lack of emotional intelligence and mental illness and failure as well, facing up to failure.
You're saying demonic influence instead of possession.
I'm not saying possession. No.
Yeah.
Right. I'm the forces of evil in the world, essentially.
I'm just having fun from theological perspective, poking at you. So it's all good.
We can
move forward.
We can go to the Gospels and give some examples of this. But so we've grown up in a world that, or at least most of our parents as Gen X, didn't really deal with some of these things as directly as they could have, dealing with emotions, dealing with mental illness. We've become more aware, but I feel often like we're still learning. Exactly. It's like, well, this is a thing, but I've not been taught how to handle these things, how to regulate myself, and how to build up resilience. And I think that for Gen Alpha, there's a great opportunity to say, learn from our learning, learn from our growing in this area, and you actually can do this. You can take these lessons, you can be a whole person that is rich and strong and deep, spiritually also rooted in the right things, and, keep going, go farther than we could go. So that's what I would hope for.
Yeah, let me just add two things. You mentioned regulation, and speaking of open access, in a sense, Dan Siegel, amazing psychologist from the U.S., co-founded an entirely new field, interpersonal neurobiology, which I'll just say and move on. It's a fascinating field, but he talks about regulating our bodies and staying in the flow, which actually comes from a Hungarian. I think he's borrowing from. Was it Hungarian? Maybe. Anyway, the idea is on. I think it's dansiegel.com, or if you Google him, you'll find a website. And from the MindSight Institute, a book he created called MindSight has this institute around it where there's courses, and in these courses, again, you can choose if you want just the lectures, like I don't want to attend anything, or you can pay more and you can attend everything. It becomes like a class where you get like a certificate or something. But you can also choose another version. And so you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. But he talks about the idea of regulation and how to do it. So if you're like, oh, I'm one of those millennials or whatever, like how? I would recommend Dan Siegel as a sort of a one-stop shop to begin, at least, for that.
That's great.
The second thing, increased agency. Yes, please.
Mm-hmm.
The more people have a self-confidence to do something, even if you mess up,
yes,
it is a good thing, and that's a foundational building block of discipling somebody. For somebody to grow, you think about it. What did Jesus do with the disciples? He increased their agency. They went from watching to participating to leading. It wasn't a like logical step-by-step thing, but he was doing it on purpose, and he was in a sense increasing their agency. So I think we should applaud that and try to fan it into flame. But before we go further, a very, very fast lightning round, because time is just getting away from us in this episode. I think I'll remember these. I wrote them in my phone, but I'm not going to pull it out. I'll remember them top of my head.
Okay.
So, favorite theologian? Yours.
My favorite theologian
of all time.
Oh, come on.
It's probably a bad question. He's be like, I
could think of biblical scholar. A favorite theologian.
You can say biblical scholar. That counts.
Does it? Oh my gosh. I'm just going to say Christopher Wright.
Safe choice.
Yeah, it is.
Why? I'm not going to ask why about that. Moving forward. Why did you name your rabbit Lucy?
Because we had been reading the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to Judah when he was 4, like bits and pieces, and that stuck in his brain. So when we asked him, what do you want to name your rabbit? The first thing he said was Judah. And we said, no, you can't name him your own name, and it's a girl. So then he said Lucy.
Nice. Last question. Favorite I can't stop. I'm done talking. Favorite Bible verse?
Yes. This is one that our formation students have to answer at the beginning of every academic year to fill out a questionnaire. It is 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, which is that all Scripture is God-breathed and profitable for a bunch of things. And the reason I like it, now I'm going the wrong direction. The reason I like it is because all Scripture, when Paul wrote that, meant the Old Testament. So it does apply to the New Testament as well. But when he wrote it, he was saying all of the Old Testament is God-breathed, and it's profitable, it's useful, practical for all these things, and for leading you to salvation. And so in many of our Christian circles, there's a tendency to just say, the Old Testament, let's just throw it out. But Paul is saying, no, there's good stuff in here. We should be preaching more from the Old Testament. You're placing a lot of value on Timothy being written pretty early. Even if it was written in the mid first century, there were other New Testament books that were in some form circulating. But the question is, were they considered Scripture? Sure. By the time we get to Peter, when he talks about.
Were you talking the
Scripture.
councils or what was considered that before because it was being written down by everybody upon hearing it and circulating it? Okay. Anyway, we'll move forward.
This is making a detour into the process of canonization.
Which would be fun if we had more time. Let's summarize the 7 things around anxiety. Where does anxiety arise? And I think perhaps we can say more, which kind of feeds into our New Year's episode now that I think about it. Embracing limitations. Maybe more is not always better. But more access to information, more means of self-education, more resources, more self-directed, increased agency, more technology, more technological merging of life. So, as Elmore says it, he calls himself a pracademic, a practical academic. Let's be pracademic for a moment, Tyler. How do we take this information as part of our knowledge toolkit in order to lead Generation Alpha for positive change through felt anxiousness? I think we do it in 2 ways. Maybe one, pick your go-to Old Testament, probably, I'm guessing, wisdom literature verse that discusses anxiety for a few minutes. And then we'll go to some guiding steps as we wrap up the episode.
So speaking of things that are profitable and practical and can lead you to salvation, Old
Tell me more.
Old Testament wisdom literature, Proverbs 12:25. Anxiety in a person's heart weighs it down, but a good word cheers it up. So this is a very much a verse that should connect with a lot of people, but especially those that are born Gen Z or Gen Alpha. Anxiety weighs us down, but a good word can lift it up. I don't know what does your translation say for that second line?
But a good word makes him glad. English Standard Version.
So that word, good word. I don't know what he's alluding to here, but Proverbs often alludes to creation theology. Is drawing a lot on creation theology. So for me, when I hear that, I think good, that God created things to be good, and He created with His word, and so it's kind of returning back to God's intent, God's design, God's purposes for us and for this world. And that also is important, that Gen Z is very much in tune with the fact that not just their lives are broken, their families are broken, but also the world is broken. And so we need God's good word to breathe life into all those areas.
Yeah, that's got me wondering about, doing a little dialectical exercise that theologians like to do, but biblical people, you tend to just be like, just stop talking. But the point is to basically take the opposite. And here it's the text is kind of assuming that anxiety it's weighing a man down, it's bad. But I would conjecture that lesser forms of anxiety, this is probably a stronger form, I would guess, are actually necessary. Agitation and so on. And those things are a part of growth. And so in a sense, they're kind of like normal life. Like it's something that we deal with. Like how the Israelites used to deal with the problem of evil. Like we live in it. It exists. We don't have to answer it. We just have to figure out how to work within it. That kind of a thing is what I wonder about there.
That's great.
But
That's great.
It does relate to encouraging.
Yes.
Which is we've seen kind of as a theme, Gen Z, Generation Alpha. And it is interesting. If something's weighing you down, a word simply just brings you up. I mean, there's some biblical metaphors there that are just amazing that we could draw out. But do we as leaders have kind words for people? Do we recognize symptoms of anxiety and go, is it the right time to listen? Or is it the right time to give a good word? Is it just a good word, or is it one that's more like a Gen Z, like, I'm going to give you this challenge because I know you can do it. By the way, here's encouragement. Or maybe it's just encouragement. We have to have wisdom, I think, as leaders. And so that moves us into some, I think, guiding steps. Next episode will be part 2. We'll get into more Bible. But here we'll just kind of wrap things up. man, there's so many things we can say. But I think I'll just break it down, and you can cut me off as you wish.
Bring it on.
Listening and not pretending to fully comprehend one person's anxiousness simply because you know what anxiety is. That's a good guiding principle. Not pretending to fully comprehend what another person's going through because you know the word, essentially. Or you've gone through something too. Well, it's not the same thing, so don't over make it the same thing, whatever that word is.
Because similar emotional responses can be triggered by very different lived experience.
And underlying triggers.
Yeah.
So you could mean something like, oh, I've been through this too, and the other person just moves further away. That's not what we're after. The second one, knowing when to insert a good word and when to stay silent. And when you stay silent, just to let your presence speak. I think God, in the Psalms, God, why do you hide your face from me? Well, in a sense, God is distant, but his presence is still there. It's not fully removed. And so even there, it's God is silent, but his presence is speaking. And so I think that's why the psalmists actually are writing, because they intuitively know that. It's just really difficult in the moment to feel it. I just conjecture. You can tell me I'm wrong. The idea of divine hiddenness just and within theology is very fascinating to me, and that's where I pull it from. Next, if given permission, I think by a person to do a form of, I almost don't want to use the phrase pastoral counseling, not in the full form of that, leading somebody, counseling, coaching, and discipleship, then if you're given permission, maybe it could be appropriate to help them name what's happening. And there's a form of counseling known as cognitive behavioral therapy. You can look it up online with our more resources that we have. And I actually have gone through this because of my chronic pain disorder, and it's fascinating. If you're rigorous, it's very, very difficult and exhausting. The point is, though, that once you name the trigger for the anxiousness, then it disarms the power of anxiety. And you think, oh, try it. It's crazy. It's like something happens and boom. It's hard work, though, because you say, like, you'll be thinking and say, oh, this is why this thought came up. And then you figure out 10 minutes later that you're still anxious. You're like, oh, well, that didn't work. And that begins a spiraling effect where you find out more and more and more. And you know you're done when there's physical relaxation and a person shows like literal relief. Like you can just see it in their body and in their eyes. And they probably can't fully understand what happened or how it connects, but it disarms the power. And oftentimes the root of the anxious thought is very different than the thought itself. So figuring out a way to appropriate that could assist a student in some cases. You're not putting them through this behavioral therapy because you're not a counselor.
Right.
But something like that, helping them to name the idea, which relates to looking for bodily signs and not just the words of students. We're embodied people. That's a common phrase. You're going to continue to hear it more and more and more and more. If you're in academics, you already are hearing it a ton. But bodily features will often give a clue as to how to help. So if a person is very agitated, they may be about to have a panic attack or anxious episode. If they're speaking calmly and lethargically, then maybe they're a depressive type of anxious and kind of resigned to, things are just going to be how they are. If they speak normally and with composure, then they may have the resources, maybe, for you to speak into their life or to coach counsel. But you have to watch for those bodily signs, those features, and not just peering into their minds, as it were. So bodily features can tell you as a leader when a person needs to speak and you not, or when you are able to listen well and then speak. Just some premeditated thoughts, mostly, but not completely, on guiding steps. Anything you want to add there, Tyler, to end?
I think it's really helpful. I would say these are really important ways that we put the person in front of us in a place of value, of saying, like, your experience is really important to me. the other side of that we have to then work on is keeping them in focus, because maybe as they're going through something, it's going to trigger something in us, and then we distance ourselves, or we try to step in and try to give answers in ways that speak to our situation. And so that's the hard work of regulation that we talked about earlier, of saying, I'm going to create space for you, and I'm going to deal with my stuff, but later. So, but that's a great form of love, is letting someone be another person, letting their experiences be unique, and honoring who they are, how they're living, and what they're going through.
Yeah, and I think we'll leave it there for this episode, as we will continue in the next one for part 2, where we'll focus more on biblical wisdom for current practice, Old and New Testament. We do thank you for those who have emailed us, sent us questions, or encouraged us as we're talking about good words over the last 3 seasons. We've been fueled to continue from hearing these things, and it just simply makes it more fun. For us, definitely, as we talk back and forth, but also as we're in discussion with you, we hope that's the same thing. If you would like us to talk about a very specific area of mental health as part of a Knowledge Toolkit, email us very, very soon, and we may be able to still fit it into the rest of the season. Praxologie at formission.org.uk, and again, we may be able to fit that in. But until next time, we say, go in the peaceful presence of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.